The plaza was a slab of black stone under an alien sky, lit not by warmth but by the cold shimmer of the Empire's banners. The crowd was silent, not out of respect, but because soldiers ringed the square with rifles primed. In the center stood a single figure, hands bound, back straight, uniform tattered yet clean. The human general. They had stripped him of rank insignia, but nothing could strip the weight in his eyes. A voice, mechanical and distorted, echoed from the platform's amplifiers. Charges were read in the Empire's guttural tongue, inciting rebellion, orchestrating military resistance, destroying imperial assets. They said the words like they were facts carved in stone, but everyone knew the real crime. He had refused to kneel. The sentence was death, to be carried out publicly so all species know the futility of defiance. From a balcony above, imperial dignitaries observed, their scaled faces set in expressions of bored contempt. To them, this was not justice, it was theater. The general lifted his head toward them, gaze unwavering. The translator implant rendered his voice in the Empire's language, calm and even. Asterisk. You believe this ends something. You believe you've made a point. But you've only given my people a reason they'll never forget. And they never stop. Asterisk. There was no scream, no plea, no flinch when the executioner stepped forward. One swift motion, a sharp hum of energy, and the body crumpled to the cold stone. The Empire's flag shimmered above it as though sealing the act into history. The broadcast was transmitted instantly across dozens of sectors, carried on imperial news networks as proof of dominance. The Empire wanted the galaxy to see human defiance crushed. It worked, but not as they intended. On human colonies light years apart, the footage played in public halls, homes, and military outposts. People stopped mid-task to watch. Anger came first, hot and sharp, but then something colder took root. Not the rage that burns itself out, but the kind that settles deep, waiting. Families who had never served spoke of the general as though he had defended them personally. Veterans stared at the screen, silent, jaws set. Politicians received a flood of messages, asterisk do something star. On Earth itself, the transmission reached the War Council chamber within minutes. No one spoke when the final frame froze on the general's lifeless form. The only sound was the faint hum of the secure chamber's shielding. Around the table sat leaders from every human-controlled territory, military, economic, scientific. The usual friction between factions was gone. They didn't argue over blame or policy. The decision had already taken shape in their minds the moment they saw the look in his eyes before he died. No declarations were issued. No public threats were made. Outside the council walls, the galaxy assumed humanity would protest, perhaps launch a token strike, then fade back into compliance. The Empire counted on it. History had shown smaller powers folding under overwhelming force. But humans had always written their own histories. Quiet orders began moving through secure, encrypted channels. Civilian transports were diverted without explanation. Mining operations in distant asteroid fields went silent. Research stations in deep orbit ceased transmitting altogether. A dozen minor trade routes, all seemingly unconnected, began reporting navigation delays and maintenance shutdowns. The Empire's analysts noted the oddities but dismissed them. To them, humans were loud when angry. This quiet meant they were broken. They did not understand. Among those who saw the execution, there was no cry for immediate vengeance. They knew the Empire wanted a quick, emotional reaction, a battle they could win decisively to cement their dominance. Instead, humans did what they did best when threatened beyond endurance. They thought, they planned, and they prepared to make the price so high it would echo for generations. Every soldier who had served with the general remembered his voice during campaigns. Win the war before you fire a shot. His death did not erase that lesson, it made it gospel. Across scattered human territories, individuals began to vanish from public rosters. Officers resigned from visible posts, only to reappear in classified assignments. Supply requests doubled in certain sectors, then tripled, all signed under infrastructure readiness. By the time the Empire's celebratory broadcast faded, the true consequence had already begun to move. The general had fallen, but in doing so, he had become something the Empire had no weapon against, a unifying symbol. Not of martyrdom, but of unfinished business. When the War Council adjourned that night, the stars above Earth burned the same as they had for millennia. But for those in the room, every constellation had shifted. The galaxy would not know it yet, but the clock had started ticking, not toward war as the Empire understood it, but toward something far more decisive. The execution had been meant to close a chapter. It had only written the prologue. Within hours of the Council's adjournment, the machinery of preparation began turning in silence. No press releases, no rallying speeches, only a controlled shift of resources that moved like a shadow across human space. Freight schedules altered without explanation, research budgets were reallocated through obscure channels, and military personnel began disappearing from visible posts, their names struck from public records. To the casual observer, it was bureaucratic noise. To those within the inner circle, it was the assembly of an answer to the Empire's act. In the cold void beyond charted lanes, fleets that had never been acknowledged by any public ledger stirred from dormancy. Entire squadrons, built under the guise of deep space exploration or mining support, revealed their true nature as warships bristling with classified technology. They were hidden among asteroid belts, buried beneath the ice crusts of uninhabited moons, or cloaked within electromagnetic storms. Every hull carried weaponry the Empire had never catalogued, systems designed not to match Imperial firepower but to circumvent it entirely. The Council's military strategists were not interested in direct confrontation, not yet. They mapped the Empire's logistics like a surgeon mapping an arterial system, identifying every point where a precise strike could bleed it without warning. Supply depots, hyperspace relay nodes, fuel refineries, and command relays were charted in meticulous detail. Every target was evaluated not just for its destruction value but for the cascading consequences it would unleash. Parallel to the physical preparations, the quiet war in the digital realm began. Artificial intelligence constructs, seeded into Imperial data traffic months earlier under unrelated operations, were awakened. They moved invisibly through comm channels, cataloging fleet movements, production schedules, and even personnel rosters. Where direct access was impossible, false anomalies were introduced to mislead and distract. On more than one occasion, entire Imperial patrols were rerouted in pursuit of phantom threats, leaving gaps in defensive coverage exactly where human planners needed them. Psychological pressure was a weapon to be sharpened as well. Carefully engineered rumors began to circulate in neutral systems, tales of human retaliation plans far beyond their actual capability. Some stories painted Earth as having weapons that could collapse entire suns, others that they had agents embedded within the Imperial Court itself. The Empire dismissed them publicly, but the rumors forced them to spread their defenses thin, unsure which stories might be true. Allies were approached with calculated subtlety. No promises of safety were made, only cold statements of fact. The Empire had crossed the line, and its retribution would be inevitable. Some species, long oppressed under imperial taxation and military oversight, quietly pledged resources, intelligence, or safe harbor. Others remained silent but opened their borders to unmarked human vessels. Each arrangement was logged and compartmentalized, ensuring that no single betrayal could expose the whole network. Human industry shifted gears with barely a ripple in the markets. Civilian shipyards received infrastructure grants that allowed them to upgrade facilities and expand capacity. Within those expansions came the quiet insertion of military production orders, weapon components disguised as industrial machinery, armor plating labeled as atmospheric shielding. Planetary defense contractors hired entire new shifts under the cover of energy grid maintenance projects. The economy didn't boom, but beneath the surface it pulsed with hidden acceleration. Training intensified in isolated facilities where no outside transmissions were permitted. Recruits were not taught to outgun the Empire, they were taught to outthink it, to dismantle its reach without giving it a clear target to strike back at. War games simulated sectors with overwhelming Imperial superiority, drilling teams to slip in, dismantle critical systems, and vanish before alarms could be raised. Every move was calculated to remain beneath the Empire's threshold for concern. Their analysts, accustomed to interpreting strength in visible military buildup, saw nothing alarming. To them, humanity appeared restless but constrained, the sting of their loss fading into resignation. Reports to Imperial High Command described humans as strategically exhausted. The very absence of visible defiance was, to those who understood the human temperament, the most dangerous sign of all. By the time the last of the hidden fleets confirmed readiness, the framework for the operation was complete. The Empire still held the illusion of control, its admirals certain that their dominance was secure. But the humans had already decided that the war would not begin with a declaration. It would begin with the sudden collapse of everything the Empire trusted to keep it untouchable. The general's execution had set the fuse. The preparations ensured that when it burned to the end, the explosion would be absolute. The moment chosen was calculated to the second, synchronized across fleets, and strike teams scattered over dozens of light years. At the exact instant Imperial markets opened for their standard trade cycle, an anomaly rippled through their primary communication grid. It lasted only milliseconds, dismissed by local systems as a routine fluctuation, but in that span the control protocols for hundreds of relay hubs were rewritten. Entire sectors found their traffic rerouted into endless loops, military orders delayed or lost altogether. Commanders issued countermeasures only to discover their own channels compromised. The disruption wasn't just in the data, it was in the trust those systems relied on. Before the Empire could identify the source, the physical strikes began. Cargo convoys feeding Imperial garrisons vanished without distress signals, their transponders later found adrift in empty space. Fuel depots along key hyperspace junctions erupted into silent blossoms of plasma, cutting entire regions off from reinforcement. At first, the losses seemed scattered, isolated incidents blamed on piracy or industrial mishap. But the pattern emerged quickly to anyone watching closely. Each target was a node in the Empire's logistical spine, severed with precision to cause maximum paralysis. Shipyards and three core systems fell dark within the same hour. The Empire's initial investigation teams reported hulls torn open from within, as though the attackers had known exactly where to place charges for catastrophic failure. Orbital defense grids in those systems remained intact, untouched, proof that the strikes weren't meant for conquest, only for erasure. By the time Imperial reinforcements arrived, every scrap of critical technology had been reduced to slag or carried away, leaving only empty frames drifting above silent worlds. Civilian traffic began to choke the space lanes as rumors spread faster than official reports. Merchants diverted shipments, fearing sudden embargoes. Border colonies closed their ports to Imperial inspection crews, citing local security concerns. The Empire's propaganda networks worked overtime to frame the events as accidents or rogue sabotage, but the repetition of the phrase for the general across targeted systems undermined every broadcast. No one knew how the message was being delivered. Some found it etched into the scorched plating of destroyed facilities, others saw it scroll briefly across military consoles before vanishing. Imperial admirals convened emergency councils, arguing over whether they faced coordinated insurgency or something far larger. The Empire's military doctrine had always relied on overwhelming presence: strike fast, strike visibly, crush resistance before it gathered momentum. But now they were chasing phantoms. Every time they concentrated forces in one region, another, seemingly unrelated sector suffered simultaneous strikes. Attempts to bait human forces into open battle failed entirely. The attackers would not engage unless the terrain and timing were in their favor, vanishing before Imperial guns could lock on. The psychological weight of the campaign began to press harder than the material damage. Officers hesitated to take patrols without double-checking supply status, fearing their next assignment might strand them light years from support. Maintenance crews tore down and rebuilt perfectly functional systems, suspecting invisible tampering. Small garrisons began requesting evacuation without direct threats, citing persistent uncertainty as justification. Neutral species, watching from the sidelines, noted the Empire's uncharacteristic fumbling. Traders who had once paid heavily for Imperial escort now questioned its value. Some began quietly diverting business toward human-controlled space, calculating that the emerging power might offer better stability in the long run. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Every lost contract was another fracture in the facade of imperial supremacy. Weeks into the strikes, the Empire still had not confirmed the full scale of the forces arrayed against it. In truth, the number of actual combat ships deployed was small compared to the devastation they caused. Precision replaced brute force at every step, every attack chosen not for spectacle but for strategic necessity. It was a campaign built to hollow the Empire out from within before it even realized how much of its strength had been carved away. In the war rooms hidden deep within human space, no victory celebrations were held. The operations were only the first movements in a much larger design. The Empire had been forced to react, shifting from an offensive power to one scrambling to defend itself. That shift was irreversible. The moment they stopped dictating the pace, the war had already begun to slip from their control. Without warning, the silence broke. Across the galaxy, human fleets emerged not from expected hyperspace lanes but through transient wormholes opening in the heart of Imperial territory. The technology was something the Empire had believed theoretically impossible, the kind of advancement their own scientists had dismissed as unstable. Yet here it was, deployed with precision so exact that entire battle groups appeared inside secure orbital perimeters before alarms could fully register. Targets were not chosen for emotional impact, they were chosen for the Empire's survival value. Central command hubs that coordinated fleet assignments were the first to go, struck and synchronized assaults that severed operational oversight across multiple sectors. Planetary governors who had overseen resource exploitation vanished in coordinated extractions, leaving leadership vacuums that imperial bureaucracy could not fill fast enough. Within hours, the chain of command fractured, with isolated garrisons forced to make independent decisions they had never been trained for. Industrial worlds that had powered the Empire's fleets became wastelands of molten steel and scorched sky. Orbital bombardments were brief, efficient, and absolute, carried out with a level of accuracy that left non-military sectors untouched but annihilated every dockyard, weapons foundry, and fuel processor in range. The speed of execution allowed no counterstrike. By the time Imperial reinforcements reached a targeted system, the human fleets were already striking another dozens of light years away. The pressure was unrelenting. Every time the Empire attempted to consolidate forces to defend a key sector, human operations split into multiple thrusts, forcing them to scatter again. Fleet commanders complained of fighting an enemy that seemed to exist in more than one place at a time. Wormhole deployments allowed human ships to dictate not just where the battles occurred, but whether battles occurred at all. The Empire could not force an engagement, they could only respond. Civilian populations in Imperial space began to experience the war in ways no broadcast could suppress. Energy shortages rippled outward from destroyed power relays. Food distribution networks failed as storage hubs went dark. Trade vessels refused to fly Imperial banners, afraid it would mark them as targets. Even in the core worlds, shortages and rationing became unavoidable, eroding the myth of the Empire's unshakable stability. For a species long subjected to Imperial control, the shift in perception was immediate. The invincibility of the Empire had been its greatest weapon, and now that illusion was gone. Independent militias began seizing Imperial garrisons, confident that human forces would keep the larger fleets too occupied to retaliate effectively. Some worlds even broadcast open declarations of neutrality, knowing the Empire could not afford to divert strength to enforce compliance. Imperial attempts at negotiation were met with silence. Multiple envoys sent under flags of truce found their transmissions ignored or intercepted. The absence of dialogue was deliberate. Humanity would not allow the Empire to dictate terms or pace. Every unanswered plea deepened the perception that the balance of power had already shifted. Alien observers, neutral or otherwise, began aligning with the momentum they saw forming. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy painted a picture of human operations that were not just coordinated but anticipatory, as if every Imperial move had been predicted before it was made. That perception carried its own weight, forcing Imperial commanders to question every order, every reinforcement plan, every supply request. Doubt, once seated, spread faster than any fleet. Through all of this, the human forces retained their discipline. There were no raids on civilian population centers, no needless destruction outside of military and industrial objectives. The message was as deliberate as the strikes themselves. This was not chaos. It was the systematic dismantling of a power structure that had chosen to make an enemy of humanity. Each operation reinforced the same truth, that this conflict was not for conquest but for correction. By the time the fourth week of full-scale operations concluded, the Empire's territory was no longer a continuous expanse. It had become a series of disconnected strongholds, surrounded by systems either hostile or uncertain. The vastness that had once been their advantage now worked against them, every light year another stretch of vulnerable supply lines and weakened control. The maps in their war rooms told the story plainly. The shape of their empire was shrinking, and the pace of its collapse was no longer something they could dictate. When the momentum shifted entirely beyond recovery, humanity moved from dismantling to defining the new order. The remaining imperial fleets, fractured and isolated, were not destroyed outright but methodically disarmed. Captains were given a choice: surrender their vessels intact or watch them rendered into drifting hulks by precision strikes that spared crews but erased combat capability. Most chose surrender. Those who resisted found themselves disabled without a single shot aimed at their lives, the humiliation of helplessness spreading faster than defeat. On occupied worlds, human forces established control with surgical precision. Civilian governance was left in place under strict non-interference policies, but every mechanism of imperial authority, military oversight, resource taxation, forced conscription, was dismantled in days. The removal was as clean as it was irreversible. What remained was not chaos but a vacuum the Empire could never refill. Symbolism was woven into every act. In the plazas of former administrative capitals, statues of the executed general were raised, not as monuments of grief but as markers of consequence. Beneath each stood inscriptions in dozens of languages. This is what happens when you mistake restraint for weakness. The imagery was impossible to ignore. It became part of the daily life of the very worlds that had once celebrated imperial power. The former core systems were transformed into case studies in deliberate restraint. Infrastructure critical to civilian survival was preserved, but every facility capable of manufacturing war material was rendered inoperable with methods that ensured it could never be rebuilt without human approval. The Empire's leadership, stripped of its fleets and production base, found itself presiding over a hollow structure, powerless to enforce decrees beyond the range of its voice. The psychological impact ran deeper than the material losses. Former imperial officers spoke in low voices about human patience, recounting how years of apparent compliance had masked preparations that no surveillance had detected. They told their successors to never provoke humans again, describing them not as conquerors but as an inevitability, something that could not be stopped once set in motion. Children in those territories grew up hearing warnings not to test. The ones who remember. Beyond the former imperial borders, a new council formed, not through conquest but by invitation. Worlds that had endured under the Empire's reach joined willingly, drawn by the stability humanity now represented. The Council's charter enshrined limits on military expansion and prohibited the exploitation of member worlds, binding even human fleets to its oversight. It was governance built not on fear of reprisal but on the knowledge of what had been done to the Empire, and the unspoken truth that it could be done again. For humanity, the victory was not measured in captured territory or plundered resources, but in the removal of the Empire as a threat for generations. Every tactical decision had been aimed at permanence, destroying not just the means but the will to challenge them again. The lesson was etched into the fabric of interstellar politics. Human retribution was not reckless, it was calculated, and it did not end until the objective was absolute. On the anniversary of the general's execution, no speeches were given. Across human space and on the worlds once ruled by the Empire, lights were dimmed for a single minute. In that silence, there was no mourning, only acknowledgement. It was a reminder that the path from insult to reckoning could be long, but it was never forgotten. The empire that had sought to make an example of a single man was now itself the example. Its maps were reduced to scattered territories held together by memory rather than command, its names spoken more as a cautionary tale than a claim to power. Humanity had not set out to replace it with their own banner, they had chosen instead to leave it standing, diminished and broken, so every being who looked upon it would understand the price of arrogance. What lingered was not the image of fleets in battle, but the understanding of the mind behind them. Humanity's strength had been in refusing to fight on the Empire's terms, in striking only when every move led to the inevitable. The galaxy had learned that humans did not fight for sport or expansion, they fought for justice, and when that justice was denied, they would take it with interest. The closing words of the general, replayed now in dozens of languages, became the final seal on the lesson. We are patient. We remember. We finish what you start.